Many of you may not know this, but I had the opportunity when I was in seminary between my second and before I began my third year, an opportunity to go overseas to Taiwan to serve in the church. Part of the reason I did that was I did have some inkling or feeling in some ways about maybe I was being called to mission work overseas. A big part of why I wanted to experience being a mission volunteer overseas was so that I could learn how Christians lived in other countries. And so I had this really odd experience in which one moment I'm sitting in my dorm room munching on pizza, watching March Madness on television one day, and within a few days I find myself in a rainforest in the mountains of Taiwan at a small college serving a people who were native people who only a few generations before had been headhunters. So I found myself in this odd juxtaposition between my normal life in which everything was going along and all of a sudden finding myself in a situation and context in which I was deprived of the very things that had made up my life in many ways. Did I mention they had no pizza? I found myself eating among many different things, mountain rats, snake, and even monkey brains. And it was, I must confess, a rather jarring experience. The normal things that made up my life, the normal things I took for granted, which is, did I mention I didn't have pizza? Which was a normal life full of busy activities, of going to classrooms, of watching television, of going to meetings. I was suddenly finding those in the mountains of Taiwan, I was deprived of those things. One of the hardest things was I spoke very little Chinese, and so the very normal sense of what would be how I define myself in conversations and those kinds of things, in many ways, I found myself in the mountains of Taiwan, hardly able to communicate with those around me. And the other hard part of that was that I found myself totally reliant on the kindness of strangers. If I wanted to go anywhere, I had to rely on a student to take me there or a teacher. And in many ways, it felt very vulnerable, and it was not something I had anticipated. I will be honest that it was a profoundly disturbing experience, not only a cultural kind of jarring, but also a sense of what I had taken for granted was taken away. And I will be honest, most of the time I spent the first few months wondering, how the heck do I get out of here? But something profound happened in the time I spent in the mountains of Taiwan, in that it became a deeply, profoundly spiritual experience, where I had felt there was a scarcity of things for me to experience. I found myself focused on relationships, where I was missing my pizza and television and those accoutrements of what I had experienced before. I found, in some ways, in the community that I experienced with those who I could not impress by my knowledge, who I could not impress in any way, I found a sense of community even as I was totally vulnerable, totally reliant upon them. I felt profoundly deprived, and yet profoundly experienced some abundance beyond my imagination. The story I read to you this morning is a very familiar story to most of us. It is, in fact, probably one of the miracles most of us know about. It is one of the most repeated miracles in the Gospels. In fact, there are 6 stories of the feeding of the multitude. There are one of the feeding of the 5,000 in each of the 4 Gospels, which is unusual. And there are 2 in Matthew and Luke, another story about not only the feeding of the 5,000, but another instance in which Jesus was feeding the 4,000. So it's obvious this story of Jesus feeding so many from such little things, it's obvious that that was a very important story to the early church. Because it was one that was part of their understanding of who Jesus was to them as a community and as disciples. And the stories are all basically the same. Jesus comes upon a large crowd. Often it was a large crowd that followed him. Someone notes how hungry this crowd is. In some of the stories, the disciples encourage Jesus to send them off so that they can feed themselves. In our particular story this morning, Jesus asks a rhetorical question: how are we going to feed 5,000 people? How are we going to do that? One of the disciples says, it would take half a year's wages to get it done. And then another disciple, kind of in a weird, odd kind of interjection, says, there's this young boy over here. He has 5 loaves and 2 fishes. And I can almost hear the other disciples giggling at this idea, but then Jesus invites the whole great crowd to sit down on the grass. And we are told he blessed the bread and broke it and handed it out. And that there was enough for everyone to eat, so much so that there were 12 baskets full of the leftovers. You know, if we're honest, that's really an odd miracle. You know, the walking on water, that's a miracle, you know. The healing of people, that's a miracle. And in fact, in the Gospel of John, he doesn't call it a miracle, he calls it a sign, an indication of something. And it was obviously very important to the church to understand what that sign represented. It's a very strange miracle or sign to lift up about what it means to have Jesus in your life and what it means to follow Jesus. And what we have is that we have a world, and let's be honest, it's a surprising characteristic of our society and culture. We who live in such abundance, we who have so much, and yet we see the world as having scarcity. In fact, in our communities, in our societies, to us, it's a zero-sum game, is it not? I have mine, and I am threatened when others might be getting what we have. And often that drives how we organize ourselves economically and politically, a fear that someone will get what we have, because it's a zero-sum game. The world is scarcity. And it's not surprising we think that way, because we have, every single person in the pew here has been educated since you were born, essentially, to view the world in that way. You have been told, you have been socialized, we all have been told and socialized to think in terms of scarcity. Through advertising, we're told we're missing something, right? For advertising, we're told that we're incomplete, that we need this new car, or we need this particular item, that if we have it, we will be complete. But never do we have an experience of abundance amidst the scarcity. And the thrust of the story of the feeding of 5,000 is just that truth, that in Jesus, we have one who calls us to perceive the world not in terms of what we are missing or in terms of what we don't have, but to view the world as filled with abundance. And that doesn't sound that radical. In fact, it seems kind of pithy to say that. But the truth is, it's so hard for us, the society in which we live, to look at our lives as filled with abundance rather than scarcity. I have often thought the miracle, and part of the reason for that, I think, is because we tend to think in terms of only ourselves, our hyper-individualism. Maybe we might think in terms of our particular family. It's hard for us to think beyond that. And I've often thought that the miracle that Jesus performed in the feeding of the 5,000 or the 4,000, the real miracle wasn't that Jesus did a magic sleight of hand and there were a lot more. He kind of multiplied the loaves and fishes and there were a lot more. I think the miracle was that there were these 5,000 people. They were sitting down. And the miracle, the true miracle, was Jesus convinced them, you have abundance, share it with each other. Well, it could be he kind of did some hocus pocus, but the real miracle is to convince us when we live amidst scarcity that there is so much abundance, we share it with each other. Now, lest we think this is some vague idea, I have often noticed in the church that we do this often. We operate as a church, as disciples out of a sense of scarcity. We look around us and say, not celebrating who's at worship, but worried about who's not at worship. We focus on what we are missing rather than on the abundance that already exists among us. And we're not alone as a church in doing this. All churches do it in some ways because we live in a society of scarcity when Jesus calls us to see abundance. Now, the most powerful thing we preach, I believe, as Presbyterians, as followers of Jesus, the most important thing we preach is grace. And there is kind of a twofold aspect to grace. One, we've probably thought about, which is the sense in which we encounter in God someone who embraces us and loves us in the midst of our scarcity. In the sense in which God's love is so abundant, God says to us, you are enough. You don't have to do anything to be enough. You are enough, is what Jesus conveyed about how God sees us. And there is incredible joy in that realization that I don't have to do something in order to be enough. God is telling me, you are enough. And that's good news. Viewing God in terms of abundant love. But the second aspect of grace that we probably don't talk about enough is that if we really embrace that first part, that God says to us, you are enough, then we know that we are called to turn to each person in the pew next to us and for us to say to them and to know, you are enough. To say to our children, to our neighbor, to the stranger, to the immigrant, to whoever we encounter in the world, this world is abundantly surrounded by God's love, and you don't have to prove a thing. You are enough. That's our challenge. The church, as disciples, is to live lives of abundance in a world that sees only scarcity, to see our lives and to view the world not in terms of what's missing or incomplete, but affirming the goodness and abundance of God's love in our lives and in the lives of all those around us. To God be the glory this day and forevermore. Amen.